Today we want to look at these questions about macromolecules. The human body uses different macromolecules for different reasons. And how are these macromolecules useful? So our first question is what are they? And then our next question is, how are they useful? So let's take a look at this first one. What are some macromolecules, especially that are important to the human body? We put them into 4 categories: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. And what I'll try to do is explain each one in order. And as we look through each one, we'll try to see the structure, what's it made of. We'll try to see what does it do. We'll try to see how is it useful for each of these macromolecules. So let's start with carbohydrates. What's in a carbohydrate? What makes up a carbohydrate? So let's start with that. Take a look at the little diagram here. And what elements do you see in the diagram? This is a picture of a pretty common sugar. Carbohydrates are sugars. So here's a pretty typical sugar. Notice that you see carbon, that's the C. You see hydrogen, that's the H. You see oxygen, that's the O. So you basically have carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. That's what carbohydrates, sugars, are made of. Now, depending on how big the sugar, that will determine how much you see of each one. Whether you see only a few carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, or if you see a bunch. But this is a simple sugar, a glucose. You can see the carbon ring. More complex sugars are going to have chains, lots and lots of these glucose molecules. There's several categories for carbohydrates. So when you think of sugars, are there more than one type or category? And the answer is yes. There's definitely more than one type or category. Monosaccharides are simple sugars, like glucose, fructose, galactose. Disaccharides are double sugars. So if you put 2 glucoses together, if 2 glucose molecules are together, that makes up a disaccharide, or double sugar. These would be things like sucrose and maltose and lactose. Polysaccharides are super big carbohydrates. Things like glycogen, starch, cellulose. The carbohydrates we would find in things like spaghetti. So let's take a look at some of these categories then. Here's some examples of monosaccharides: glucose, fructose, galactose. Here's some examples of disaccharides. So sucrose, for example, is going to be a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule together. So you have 1 glucose, 1 fructose together. That makes up a sucrose. Now here's a little trick. All 3 of these examples of disaccharides are going to have at least 1 glucose molecule. So if you're trying to remember these or memorize these for whatever reason, just start out by writing glucose, 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 because they each have that glucose sugar molecule. Sucrose will have a glucose first, then a fructose. So glucose plus fructose makes this plant kind of sugar. The sugar we would find in table sugar. The sugar we would find in Mountain Dew. You can see how much sugar there is in Mountain Dew. Maltose is a grain kind of sugar, and that's going to be a glucose molecule, and then another glucose molecule, 2 glucose molecules. You'll find that in things like malt sugar. So when you're like, I'd like a chocolate milkshake, malt that malt sugar, that grain sugar. It's also what you typically find in breads, which is why it's nice to eat glucose, maltose, disaccharides, before an exercising event. Because it's easy to break down, and once your body breaks it down, like an English muffin, let's say, once your body breaks it down, you get 2 sugar molecules that your body can use. If you drink Mountain Dew, you'll get 1 sugar molecule your body can use, and the other one it has to modify before you can use it. So just by eating maltose, it makes it easy on your body to get energy really quick, which is why if you eat something like an English muffin, let's say, right before an athletic event, you can get the benefits of that sugar. Lactose is the disaccharide you find in milk. Glucose first, then galactose, so milk products. And you might know someone even that's lactose intolerant. They don't have the enzyme to break that lactose down into glucose and galactose. Your saliva has an enzyme, amylase, that starts breaking down grain sugars in your mouth. Polysaccharides are really big, complex carbohydrates, we call them sometimes. Cellulose is a complex carbohydrate you find in plants. We can't really break that down very well in our bodies, but it's still important to eat things like lettuce and broccoli. And even though we can't break it down, our body can't break it down, doesn't mean we shouldn't eat it. We eat it probably because we get some vitamins from it, and that's important, minerals, and that's important. But also, that fiber, we call this fiber, helps to keep our colon clean. It helps us to be regular. Starch is another complex carbohydrate. We get that in things like potatoes and grains, spaghetti, things like that. It's a way a plant stores energy in starch. We store a carbohydrate in our liver called glycogen. If you were to eat a side of beef, some glycogen would be in that meat. So lots of things, lots of animals will store glycogen in their muscles and liver. Humans store glycogen in their muscles and liver. That's a complex carbohydrate that we often use for energy. So what do we use carbohydrates for? Why do we eat them? Why do we have them? Why do we store them? What are they there for? So here's some uses for carbohydrates. Mostly we use it for energy. Carbohydrates is our body's go-to energy source. Like, we use carbohydrates for energy. For each gram of carbohydrate that we eat, we get 4 calories for that. So if you were to eat 100 grams of crackers, let's say, you would get 400 calories from carbohydrates. And you should make around 60% of your daily calories carbohydrates, which is why on the food pyramid, a large part is dedicated to eating whole grains, because that gives you some fiber, and breads. That's your body's main energy source, carbohydrates. It's your body's main energy source. Let's take a look at this label. Take a look at this label for a Coca-Cola. Do we have any carbohydrates in the Coca-Cola? So when we look at this label, we're looking for this right here, total carbohydrates. And in this case, 27 grams. Now, if there's 27 grams and 4 calories per gram, you simply have to multiply 27 by 4. Sometimes there's a subcategory for simple sugars, which in the case of soda is going to be sucrose, right? The table sugars, just like you saw in the Mountain Dew. There's not going to be the complex carbohydrates in there, the table sugars. So you get a fructose and a glucose. All the sugars in Coca-Cola happen to be simple sugars. So they put a little subcategory right there, 27 grams of simple sugars. How about lipids? We sometimes call them fats and oils. Those are all lipids, this category of lipids. Take a look at the structure. Just like carbohydrates, lipids still are made of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. The ratio is much different though. The hydrogen to oxygen ratio is typically of 2 to 1. Some lipids are categorized as saturated. Others are in a category called unsaturated. So here's examples of saturated fats. Here's examples of unsaturated fats. Well, what are some differences? One of the major differences is this right here. What makes them saturated? Why do we use the word saturated to call lipids? So think of it like a sponge. We put a sponge in water, and we can saturate the sponge with water. So at some point, this sponge is going to absorb all the water that it can, and it will be saturated. So you can see how the water is dripping out of the sponge, because it can't hold it anymore. So at some point it's going to drip enough out, and then this sponge will be holding the maximum amount of water saturated. If I were to squeeze the sponge and wring all that water out, or at least a lot of it out, now I would say the sponge is unsaturated. I can absorb some more water with my sponge. Fats are similar. Lipids are similar when it comes to hydrogens. If the carbons are saturated with hydrogens, they cannot make any more chemical bonds with hydrogens. All the bonds are taken. We would say that that lipid is saturated. An unsaturated fat or lipid would still have some spaces for carbon and hydrogen to bond. So there would be some double bonds here because carbon would be able to take on more hydrogen if it had to. So saturated fats are typically animal products, like butter. They're typically solid at room temperature, like bacon fat. You can think of like the strips of bacon, solid at room temperature. And from animals, they're animal products. Unsaturated fats are things like oils. They're from plants. They're liquid at room temperature, like that. Now we can take an unsaturated fat and we can saturate it. We can make it somewhere in between. And that's where we get things like margarine, somewhere in between, a semi-solid, where all we've done is taken an unsaturated fat, added hydrogens to it, so it became semi-saturated. Why do we use lipids in the body? Like, would it be good if I got rid of all my body fat? If I was like, no more fat in my body, would that make me healthy? Would that be beneficial? Well, remember that lipids are going to have some uses. They're a macromolecule. It does have some uses in the body. One of the uses is for cell membranes. Take a look at this. All the membranes that surround your cells are a lipid bilayer. This is a layer of lipid chain. This is a layer of lipid chain. Without any lipids in your body, your cells wouldn't be able to stay together. You would be dead. So we definitely need some lipids for cell membranes. We also need them for steroid hormones, which can be kind of an interesting problem for particularly female athletes with low body fat. Their bodies are unable to make some of the steroid hormones. Because of that, their menstrual cycle might be off, or they might not menstruate while they're training because their body fat is so low that they can't make steroid hormones, which are typically sex-related hormones. So it might throw off things like their menstrual cycle. We use fat for insulation. It helps keep us warm. Fat has 9 calories per gram. Now remember, sugars only had 4. Fats have double the amount of calories for energy per gram. So if you think of energy kind of like a battery, we're able to store way more energy in a much smaller battery if we use fats. Or maybe think of it this way. If we took the energy stored in your body and we made it carbohydrates, you would weigh twice as much approximately. If we made it like fat, then we could store way more energy in a much smaller space. Now this is 5 pounds of fat. Easier to gain than lose, right? Much easier to gain than lose. And about 25% of your daily calories should be fat. Of that 25%, the vast majority should be unsaturated fats. Polyunsaturated fats, which means really unsaturated. Take a look at our Coca-Cola label. Are there any fats in Coke? Well, there's definitely lots of calories. We get most of those calories from sugar. There's some salt. Total fat, 0. No lipids in Coke. Or protein in Coke. And that's what we'll look at next. Proteins. structure is a little bit different than the others. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sometimes sulfur. So instead of just having carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, now we're adding nitrogen and sulfur to make proteins. Proteins are made up of 20 amino acids. 12 of those, approximately 12 of those, are going to be essential amino acids. Approximately 12 of those, proteins are made up of amino acids. 20 different amino acids. Approximately 12 of those are going to be non-essential. Your body can just make them. Some literature will say 11 is close. The other 8 or 9, depending on how you look at it, 8 or 9 are going to be non-essential. That means you have to eat these amino acids. Your body just can't make them from raw materials. You have to actually consume those amino acids, which is why it's difficult sometimes for vegetarians, because they have to make sure they get the amino acids in the right combinations to be able to make useful proteins for your body. Typically, an amino acid has this type of structure. This group right here, and then some chain we call R. Well, this is always the same. The R is different. Depending on the way the R chain of molecules looks, that's going to determine what amino acid it is. And then combinations of amino acids make protein. So maybe 50 amino acids will make a small protein. Maybe 550 amino acids will make a big protein. But proteins are made up of amino acids. We can look at protein categories this way. There's a structural part to proteins, or aspect of proteins. I like to think of it with these kind of twisty ties. That makes it kind of fun, these pipe cleaners. If I just have one long chain of amino acids, like this, one long chain of amino acids, that's called primary protein structure. If I bend this around a little bit and give it some shape, like that, let's say, that would be secondary structure. But I can take that shape, that secondary shape, I can wrap it around or with other amino acids into some shape. That's called tertiary structure, like the third level. So primary is like the first level, just a chain of amino acids. Secondary is the next level. It's like that chain of amino acids now bent into some shape. Tertiary is where they're going to be interacting with some other set of amino acids. And quaternary, or the fourth level, is going to be when those two are all bent around into a specific shape. Why is it important that their structure, that they have these shapes? Because proteins are like tools in your body. The shape of the tool matters. A Phillips head screwdriver does a really good job with certain kinds of screws. But a standard screwdriver is necessary for other ones. The shape matters. Proteins do all the jobs in your body. They're like the tools that do the jobs in your body. If you have the right structure, the right tool, you can do the right job, you can do it well. There's a chemical structure to proteins, and that's what we looked at a little bit earlier. Some with what makes up a protein and amino acids that make it up. Proteins are also enzymes. So sometimes we use proteins for things like energy, if we're in a pinch. Sometimes we use proteins for building blocks of things, for structural support, like that. Sometimes we use proteins to help speed up chemical reactions. We call those enzymes. Or help chemical reactions even happen at all. We call those enzymes. Amino acids, what proteins are made up of. Essential, you have to eat those. Non-essential, your body can make those. So we typically get proteins in our diet from eating meats, beans, nuts, things like that. How do we use protein in our body? So here's some ways that we use it. So you can see like some structural ways that we use protein. Protein makes up your hair, your fingernails, which is why you don't really feel it, but they grow. You're just adding protein to the hair and fingernails. Makes up muscle fibers, actin and myosin. Typically in your body, protein things are going to end with an IN. Actin, myosin, like that. That IN ending will help. It does give you energy. You don't typically use proteins for energy, but you can if you don't get enough carbohydrates. You can break down proteins at 4 calories per gram. We use proteins for antibodies. So this would be more chemical things, like to attack invaders. We use it for hormones, another chemical, protein-based hormones. For cell receptors, in other words, when a cell has to figure out if it should get a message or not, those receptors are made of proteins. And the structure of the protein is going to help determine its function. Just like the tools, the way the protein is designed will help determine like what it does and if it's effective. If that structure breaks down, then the tool is no longer very useful. For example, if I bend the screwdriver, it's not going to be a very useful screwdriver. So the structure kind of matters there. We can bend proteins with acids. We can bend them with heat or cold and make them ineffective. So notice the difference in some of these structures. Here we have hemoglobin. This carries oxygen in the blood. Here we have collagen, our protein structure. See how it's bent around? Primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, the fourth level. It's all bent around in a certain configuration to make your skin what it is. Collagen helps the skin be a little bit flexible. We already noticed that there's no protein in soda. No protein. How about nucleic acids then? Think of the structure of nucleic acids. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus now, and sulfur. Nucleic acid is in a double helix pattern or a helix pattern. These are things like DNA, RNA, and ATP. And DNA is most famous probably for that twisted ladder shape. You can see it looks kind of like a ladder here, but it's been twisted around. It's a double helix. Typically, the DNA structure has this. A phosphate group has a carbon-based sugar, and it has a nitrogen base. RNA is the same. So here are some examples of nucleic acids. DNA, RNA, ATP. DNA is all your genetic material. RNA is the molecule that your body uses to assemble proteins. It's like the building plans for proteins. You can use it to assemble proteins. ATP is kind of like a rechargeable battery in your body. So you have a battery, you use the battery up, and then you can recharge it. So the energy in that battery is being stored in the bonds of the adenosine triphosphate. So you have one A, and it's connected to a P, and a P. It's in this bond where we have most of the chemical energy. When we use an enzyme to break that bond and free that one, that phosphate, we can get a little energy from it. But we can add that phosphate back. And when we do, we recharge our battery. And we can use it over and over and over and over. And that makes it a really handy energy source for our body. So here's some things we use nucleic acids for in our body. DNA is going to direct lots of chemical activity, especially storing the genetic code. RNA is what we're going to use the instructions to build specific proteins. And then ATP is sometimes referred to as the energy currency of the cell. How the cell uses energy, a rechargeable source of energy, no less. But it's the basic energy molecule that the cell is going to use, the go-to energy molecule that the cell will use. So let's review some. What would be a lipid here? Butter, would that be a lipid, a carbohydrate, or a protein? Well, it's definitely from animals. Definitely has a CH and O in it. It's definitely saturated. That's a lipid. Fish is a great source of protein. Now, we can get some good oils from fish, but primarily we use fish as a protein source. Peanut oil, because it's an oil, that puts it in the lipid category. Saturated is a type of lipid, saturated and unsaturated. Steak is a protein. A tomato is going to be primarily carbohydrates, mostly fiber that we can't digest, and some vitamins. It's tasty too, but that's going to be a carbohydrate primarily. Wheat, also a carbohydrate. Steroids are lipids. Eggs are going to be a great source of protein. Starch is a carbohydrate. Sugar is a carbohydrate. This is a long chemical formula for a lipid. Cellulite, that's going to be fat. Amino acids, that's protein. Cellulose, that's what we call fiber. That's a carbohydrate. Enzymes are protein.